There's only two possible outcomes. Either they keep raising rates and crash the entire economy worse than we saw in the Depression of the 1930s. Once the inflation starts to become a problem that's not going away, that's not transitory, that the excuses made by government and policymakers will get more and more outlandish, more convoluted, more bizarre. And so that's what we're seeing now. So this is predictable. This happens, this is historically what happens. For the past 10 years, there's been the so-called widowmaker trade, where people were trying to sell the bond market or short the bond market because of the inflation that was building. But that was a widowmaker trade. It wasn't working for 10 years, really 15 years, because the Federal Reserve changed their mandate. They became the activist Fed, and so they became the buyer of first order for all the junk in the system, and they bloated their balance sheet. So they deferred the day of reckoning. So we've had now, instead of a normal business cycle in America, which would happen every generation, we've now had 2 generations or 2.5 generations without a correction or a recession to purge the malinvestment out of the system. And so that made the system incredibly fragile. And now that we're at that day of reckoning, it's going to be devastating. So the tools that the central bank has at their disposal are very blunt objects, and there's no room for nuance, really. There's only 2 possible outcomes. Either they keep raising rates and crash the entire economy worse than we saw in the Depression of the 1930s, or they're going to reverse course and engage in another round of money printing, and that would imply hyperinflation. Even Jack Dorsey saw the hyperinflation writing on the wall 6 months ago. At some point, the Fed will choke and they'll go back to massive money printing, and then the inflation will get really nasty. So then that's when you have, that's when you have gas at $10 a gallon. That's when you have food doubling and tripling again in price. That's when you have housing taking another huge leap higher. And so that's going to be the end of the post-war period of what some would call the American empire. So it lasted from 1940s to 2022, 2023. That was the American empire. That was the period. So that's it. A lot of people going back to World War II, they didn't believe what was happening in Germany, and they didn't leave, and they regretted not leaving. A lot of people did leave, some famous people like Einstein and others. I think in the United States, you have to understand that we're going into a third world war. It's a continuation of the second, which is a continuation of the First World War. A lot of the same political forces are once again coming together for a war. And if you're caught in the crosshairs of that, you're going to get killed.
I just saw a chart of the parabolic surge in the number of people in our legislative branch of the United States who are over 70. So, these guys have set in motion the decline in of our empire with the introduction of 50 years ago, the US dollar is all fiat, and thus all the stuff that followed through, the hollowing out of the US economy that was necessary in order to maintain their power for a temporary 50-year period.
The president of El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender, and in so doing gave 7 million Salvadorans the right to unconfiscatable, uncensorable wealth and property. Now, this is decentralization, democracy. Okay, this is the complete opposite of the claim of dismantling this democracy. The failure with journalism that we talked about earlier is that they go in there with a cooked story already and then bend the facts to go with the narrative. And you see that on Wall Street now, and part of the problems on Wall Street is that the markets have been subjected to this form of manipulation where big banks like Goldman Sachs, they want the bond market to be a certain price, so they start printing trades at that price and then fill in the orders to support their preconceived notion of what the price should be. So it's the opposite of price discovery, where the price is the sum total of all the buyers and sellers in the market, and you have the current price. That doesn't exist anymore in any market in the world. All markets everywhere are the opposite. The price is determined first based on a narrative, and then trades are filled in afterward to justify that price. We've now entered a new era where prices for stuff are not going to be determined by this fraud on Wall Street, but by the people who produce the stuff. The commodity producers have now taken over in pricing stuff. And that's why suddenly stuff costs more, because for decades, the price of stuff was hidden by derivatives, by Wall Street, by financialization, and all the risk was shuffled around and it was dumped in places where it was never talked about. But now that era is over, and we have a new era where the price of stuff is determined outside of America. It's determined where they produce the stuff, the commodities. So it's revealing the fact that the press in America is sadly in a sad state, where the truth is seen as the enemy of the state. And when you're talking about money that separates for the first time money from the state, well, the state's going to not like that. And so all media in America is state-sponsored media. Rolling Stone is state-sponsored media. CNN, state-sponsored media. You just have essentially the deplatforming that goes on. And it's also from El Salvador, you get to see the United States with a bit of perspective. And it's a bit sad to see a once great nation become insecure and fumble so horribly with concepts like freedom. They've completely lost the plot in the US, I'm sorry to say. El Salvador literally has the ability to pick and choose when they want to do stuff. They'll take care of the IMF when it's convenient for El Salvador. So the IMF can squawk all they want. I know, little inside baseball here, that the IMF is scared shitless about El Salvador making Bitcoin legal tender. And they're constantly, almost every day, trying to weasel their way in and have the language changed on the law. You know, if you make a mistake, you're stigmatized and your career is cut off and you're a loser. In the United States, we encourage mistakes. We say, make as many mistakes as you want, because every mistake gets you closer to winning, right? And that means you can't have censorship imposed the way that it's being imposed now, and to create the fear of mistakes as you do now. And this generation, the millennials and the Gen Z, they're being taught to fear making mistakes, which is the worst thing you could possibly do to any generation, because now they're going to become snitches.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's culturally speaking, Bitcoin is the acid of this century. You know, instead of dropping acid, you can just stack sats, and it's similar, because it takes you to a place of enlightenment that you were trying to get to with acid, or psychedelic drugs, or mushrooms,
yes,
or music. You know, that place you're trying to get to, you can get to by stacking sats.